Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of Precession Wobble. Imagine the air at 10,000 feet. It is thin, sharp, and carries the scent of ancient stone. We are standing on the jagged spine of the Andes, where the earth reaches up to touch the hem of the void. The wind does not whistle. It hums a low frequency as it passes through the vents of the high-altitude facility. This is the observatory, a cathedral of glass and steel. Below us, the world has faded into a carpet of clouds, leaving only the profound silence of the peaks. In this place, time is measured by the slow drift of the constellations across the black velvet of the sky. Every shadow here is deep, cast by the light of distant suns. We are alone, suspended between the ground and the stars. Step inside the airlock. The transition is marked by a sudden, pressurized sigh. Inside, the silence is replaced by the pulse. It is a constant, rhythmic vibration that travels through the soles of your feet, the sound of 7 miles of piping circulating coolant through the heart of the primary telescope. To maintain the purity of the images, the mirrors must be kept at a temperature so precise that even the warmth of a human hand could distort the light of a million galaxies. You can hear the liquid nitrogen moving, a faint gurgle behind the walls. It is a soothing sound, like the breathing of a giant in deep slumber. The floors are polished concrete, reflecting the dim red glow of the status lights. It is a world of shadows and soft machinery, where every footstep echoes with a hollow ring that lingers in the air. Dr. Elias Thorne was a man who lived for the wobble. He spent his nights deciphering the minute irregularities in the Earth's rotation, the subtle shifts that astronomers call precession, or the erratic rhythm of the Chandler wobble. He was a quiet man, often spending 14 hours at a stretch within the cold embrace of the dome. On this night, the air was exceptionally clear. The primary 4-meter mirror was positioned toward a cluster of stars, ready for a standard calibration sequence. This is a delicate dance of motors and software, a moment when the massive structure rotates with a grace that defies its 1,000-ton weight. Elias was alone in the observer's cage, a small platform suspended near the secondary focus. He was surrounded by the soft hum of monitors and the occasional click of a cooling fan, his face pale in the starlight. The clock struck 2 in the morning. Outside, the world was still. Inside, the automated sequence began. The dome shutters slid open with a sound like grinding silk, revealing a vertical slice of the universe. The telescope began to slew, its massive gears turning with a precision measured in microns. But on this night, something was different. The technician in the control room 3 levels below noticed a slight drag in the telemetry. A hesitation. A wobble that should not have been there. It was as if the telescope were laboring against an invisible weight. The cooling system's pulse seemed to quicken, the gurgle of the coolant becoming a frantic hiss. The technician checked the cameras, but the grainy feed showed only the dark silhouette of the telescope. The data insisted the balance was off by a fraction of a millimeter, an impossible mechanical error. When the technician finally climbed the spiral staircase to the primary deck, the smell was the first thing that felt wrong. It was metallic and sharp. The red lights flickered, casting long shadows across the telescope's mount. There, lying near the base of the primary housing, was Dr. Thorne. He was positioned as if he had simply sat down to rest, his back against the cold steel of the mirror's support. But his eyes were fixed on the opening in the dome above, reflecting the distant stars in a way that was far too still. His hand was resting on a manual override lever, his fingers curled loosely around the metal. The telescope continued its slow sweep across the sky, its shadow passing over him every few seconds like the hand of a cosmic clock. Only the steady throb of the cooling pumps remained in the cold air. The investigation would eventually look at the telemetry logs, searching for signs of lens-thurring precession or a simple mechanical failure. They would search for a reason why a healthy man's heart would simply stop. But in those first few hours, there was only the isolation. The mountain remained indifferent. The stars continued their ancient procession, wobbling through the centuries without concern for the tiny lives below. The pulse of the observatory slowed back to its resting state, the coolant settling into a steady, somnolent rhythm. The light of 1,000 suns continued to fall onto the mirror, captured by a machine that no longer had a master. As the first light of dawn grayed the eastern horizon, the telescope finished its sequence and came to a rest, pointing at nothing at all. The mystery had begun in the silence of the high mountains. The air inside the laboratory held a peculiar, preserved quality, as if the very atoms of the room had been instructed to stand still the moment the door was sealed. When the forensic team first crossed the threshold, their heavy boots made a sound that felt almost violent against the deep, unnatural quiet of the corridor. There was no scent of struggle here, no metallic tang of blood or the sharp, scorched odor of a short circuit. Instead, there was only the faint, ozone-heavy breath of high-powered servers and the cooling units that hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration. It was a sound like a distant hive, constant and indifferent to the human absence. The light was dim, filtered through the thick, reinforced glass of the observation windows, casting long, geometric shadows across the linoleum floor. Every surface seemed to shimmer with a thin veil of clinical cleanliness. Yet beneath that polish, there was a profound sense of something having gone fundamentally wrong in the middle of a mundane Tuesday afternoon. The lead investigator paused at the entrance, his gloved hand hovering just inches from the electronic keypad. The initial sweep began with the door itself. In many cases of mysterious disappearances, the wood is splintered, or the metal is scarred by the frantic use of a crowbar or the precision of a drill. But here, the brushed steel of the frame was immaculate. There were no scratches around the keyhole, no signs of a forced bypass on the magnetic strip reader. It was as if the room had simply opened its mouth and swallowed the occupant whole, then closed itself back up with a polite, automated click. They dusted the surface for prints, finding only those belonging to the victim, layered one over the other in a frantic map of daily routine. The dust on the floor was undisturbed, showing no heavy tread of an intruder, no scuff marks of a body being dragged. The room was a fortress of solitude that had remained unbreached from the outside, which only made the vacuum within more unsettling. Moving deeper into the workspace, the team focused their attention on the primary workstation. It sat in the corner like an altar to a digital god. 3 monitors were still active, their pale blue light washing over the desk in a ghostly glow. The central screen was filled with a cascading waterfall of telemetry logs, a stream of white text on a black background that looked like falling snow. This was the data from the orbital sensors, tracking the minute, agonizingly slow shifts in the Earth's axis. To an untrained eye, it was merely noise, but to the forensic technicians, it was a timeline. They noticed a half-eaten apple on a paper napkin, its flesh browned by several days of exposure to the dry, conditioned air. Next to it sat a ceramic mug, the remains of a chamomile tea, now a dark, stagnant pool at the bottom. The steam had long since vanished, leaving behind a faint ring of residue on the inside of the cup, a silent clock marking the exact duration of the abandonment. The most haunting detail was the state of the keyboard. A silver fountain pen lay uncapped across the spacebar, its nib dry and crusty with blue ink. It looked as though it had been dropped in a moment of sudden realization or perhaps a sudden shock. The chair was pushed back just a few inches, angled toward the door, as if the victim had intended to stand up and return within seconds. There was no coat left on the rack, no bag on the floor. Everything suggested a person who had stepped away for a brief glass of water, yet the workstation told a much darker story. The data stream on the monitor was not just idling, it was trapped in a loop. A specific calculation regarding the precession wobble, the slow, top-like rotation of our planet, had been initiated at exactly 4:42 in the afternoon. It was a complex simulation of the lens-thurring effect, a phenomenon where space and time are literally dragged by a rotating mass. And then, at the peak of the calculation, the input simply ceased. As the technicians began to mirror the hard drives, they realized that the data stream had been interrupted mid-sentence. Literally. In the command line interface, a single line of code remained unfinished. It ended with a flickering white cursor, a rhythmic pulse that felt like a heartbeat in a morgue. Blink, blink, blink. It was waiting for a command that would never come. This was the vanishing point. The forensics team traced the logs back through the preceding hours, searching for any sign of a system crash or an external hack. But the system was healthy. The hardware was functioning at peak efficiency. There were no error messages, no warnings of mechanical failure in the gyroscopes or the satellite links. The only failure was the human element. The stream of numbers representing the Earth's tilt, those 26,000-year cycles that govern our ice ages and our seasons, continued to pour into the buffer, filling the memory with information that no one was left to interpret. They spent hours documenting the position of every paperclip, every stray sticky note. One note, tucked under the corner of the monitor, bore a single handwritten word: nutation. It refers to the small, irregular nodding motion in the axis of rotation of a planet. To a scientist, it is a variable to be accounted for. To the investigators, it felt like a clue to the victim's state of mind. Was they obsessed with the instability of the world? Did they see a pattern in the wobble that others had missed? The silence of the lab seemed to grow heavier as the sun set outside, the shadows in the room lengthening and merging until the blue light of the screens was the only thing left. The lack of forced entry began to feel less like a mystery and more like an invitation. If no one had broken in, and the victim had not truly walked out with their belongings, where did the transition occur? The workstation remained as a lonely monument to a mind that had been occupied with the vast, swaying movements of the cosmos, only to be extinguished in a room with no exits and no witnesses. The forensic sweep eventually concluded that the room was a perfect vacuum of evidence. No fingerprints other than the victims, no foreign DNA, no sign of struggle. It was a clean slate, a terrifyingly empty vessel. The interrupted data stream remained the only witness to whatever had transpired in those final seconds. As the investigators packed their kits and prepared to leave, one of them caught a glimpse of the cursor still blinking on the central screen. It felt like a tether to a ghost, a small electric signal of a life that had been cut short in the middle of a thought. They turned off the lights, leaving the machines to whisper to one another in the dark. The case of the Precession Wobble had moved beyond the realm of simple physics and into the chilling territory of the unknown. Somewhere between the rotation of the Earth and the flickering of a screen, a person had reached their own vanishing point, leaving the rest of us to stare into the data and wonder what they saw before the stream went silent. Detective Elias Thorne stepped out of the pressurized transport and into a world where the air itself felt thin and judgmental. At 14,000 feet, the atmosphere does not welcome the human body. It merely tolerates it. Thorne felt the familiar, dull throb of altitude sickness beginning to bloom behind his eyes, a rhythmic pulsing that synchronized with the distant, mechanical rotating of the great observatory domes. He was a man who lived by the tangible, by the grit under a fingernail or the patterns of a blood spatter. But here, at the summit, everything felt ethereal. The station, a sprawling complex of silver and white, seemed less like a building and more like a ship lost in a frozen sea of clouds. He was here because the local authorities had reached their limit. The lead investigator was not greeted with the usual frantic energy of a crime scene. Instead, he was met with a silence so profound it felt heavy. The 12 scientists who remained on the mountain moved through the corridors like ghosts, their faces masks of intellectual detachment. To them, Thorn was an intruder, a man of blunt instruments entering a sanctuary of fine-tuned precision. They watched him from the shadows of the laboratory doors, their eyes bright with a mixture of suspicion and cold curiosity. These were people who mapped the movement of galaxies and calculated the weight of stars. To them, a detective was a primitive creature, obsessed with the messy, entropic details of human mortality. Thorn could feel the weight of their collective genius pressing against him, a silent, unified front of brilliant minds. His first meeting was with the station director, a man named Dr. Eris Vane, whose office overlooked the jagged peaks of the surrounding range. Vane spoke in measured, academic tones, his voice a dry rasp that reminded Thorn of old parchment. He spoke of the Precession Wobble, the slow, circular shifting of the Earth's axis, as if it were a character in the tragedy. He explained how the victim, Dr. Helena Voss, had been obsessed with this tiny, celestial instability. Thorn listened, not to the science, but to the gaps between the words. He watched the way Vane's fingers hovered over a crystal paperweight, never quite touching it. In this closed community, every gesture was a coded message. The challenge was not just finding a killer, but learning to speak a language where truth was always relative to the observer. Thorn spent the evening walking the perimeter of the facility. The cold was a physical weight, a freezing shroud that turned his breath into silver plumes. He focused on the sensory details, the way the wind whistled through the radio antennae, sounding like a choir of morning voices, the metallic tang of the recycled air inside the living quarters, the flickering blue light of the server racks that illuminated the hallways in ghostly intervals. He knew that the lack of physical evidence, the perfect vacuum left behind by the forensic sweep, was a deliberate act of genius. The killer had not just cleaned the room. They had treated the crime like a failed experiment that needed to be erased from the record. Every surface he touched felt too smooth, too sterile, as if the station itself was trying to reject the very idea of a murder. He retreated to his small, Spartan quarters to review the files. The victim, Helena, had been a woman of singular focus. Her notes were filled with calculations of the axial wobble, a rhythmic swaying of the world that occurred over 26,000 years. Thorn found himself caught in the poetry of it. The idea that everything, even the planet itself, was slightly off balance. He wondered if the killer had felt that same instability, a subtle shift in their own internal axis that led them to violence. He sat in the dark, listening to the mountain. The thin air made his heart race, a frantic drumming in the stillness. He realized then that he was not just investigating a person. He was investigating a culture of isolation, where the vastness of the universe made the value of a single life seem infinitesimally small. The night stretched on, the shadows in the room deepening into an ink-like blackness. Thorn looked out the small, reinforced porthole at the stars. Up here, they did not twinkle. They burned with a steady, cold light that offered no comfort. He thought about the 12 suspects again, each one a master of logic, each one capable of constructing a perfect lie. He would have to be patient. He would have to wait for the wobble, that one tiny moment of instability where the killer's composure would slip. The investigation was no longer a chase. It was a vigil. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythmic hum of the station's systems pull him toward a shallow rest. The mountain held its breath, waiting for the first light of dawn to reveal what the darkness had hidden. The glass of the porthole was cold against Thorn's forehead, a thin barrier between the warmth of his breath and the absolute zero of the void beyond. Outside, the stars were not the twinkling jewels of a child's story, but sharp, unforgiving points of light scattered across a velvet canvas. He pulled back, his skin prickling from the lingering chill. The observatory was silent, save for the low, rhythmic thrum of the cooling systems that kept the sensitive instruments from overheating. It was a lonely sound, like the heartbeat of a giant made of steel and silicon. Here, in the belly of the mountain, The air tasted of ozone and sterile dust. He looked down at the desk where the victim had spent his final hours. It was cluttered with handwritten notes, coffee rings that had dried into overlapping brown maps, and a single, heavy brass paperweight shaped like a celestial sphere. Everything here felt weighted with a frantic, unfinished energy, as if the air itself still held the vibration of a secret that was never meant to be whispered. The project was titled Precession Wobble. It was a thick folder, its edges frayed from constant handling. Thorne opened it slowly, the sound of the paper sliding against the metal desk echoing in the cavernous room. Inside were pages of complex calculations, tracing the slow, agonizingly patient movement of our planet. The victim had been obsessed with the idea that the Earth does not merely spin, but that it staggers through the cosmos like a dying top. Most people think of the world as a steady thing, a solid foundation beneath their feet, but these notes told a different story. They spoke of a subtle, gravity-induced lean, a shift in the orientation of the rotational axis that takes 26,000 years to complete a single circle. It is a movement so slow that a human life is not even a blink in its duration. Yet, to the victim, this wobble was the only thing that mattered. He had mapped the stars not as they are, but as they were thousands of years ago, and as they will be when humanity is nothing more than stardust again. As Thorne leaned over the glowing monitor of the main terminal, he began to pull up the mechanical logs from the night of the crime. He wanted to see how the great telescope had moved. The machine was a marvel of engineering, capable of tracking a single photon across light years of distance. Its gears were lubricated with oils that never froze, and its motors were precise to a fraction of a hair's breadth. On the screen, the data began to scroll in long columns of emerald text. Each line represented a movement, a shift in the azimuth and elevation as the telescope compensated for the Earth's rotation. To a casual observer, it was a boring ledger of mathematics, but Thorne had been trained to look for the rhythm in the numbers. He watched the timestamps, counting the seconds between each adjustment. He could almost hear the low groan of the massive dome opening to the night air, the smell of the mountain wind rushing in to meet the warmth of the laboratory. It was a dance of light and shadow, recorded in binary. The discrepancy appeared at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. It was a tiny thing at first, a variation of 0.004 degrees. In the world of high-precision astronomy, however, 0.004 of a degree is a canyon. Thorne paused the scroll, his finger hovering over the glass. He compared the movement logs of the telescope's heavy motors with the digital image files saved to the main server. According to the physics of axial precession, the stars that night should have been in a very specific position. The telescope's gears claimed they were pointing exactly where the victim's project dictated they should be, tracking the subtle wobble of the Earth's axis. But the images themselves told a lie. The stars captured in the high-resolution frames were shifted. They were not where the motors said they were. It was as if the telescope had recorded one reality while physically existing in another. The mechanical logs had been meticulously forged to match a theoretical perfection that did not exist in the actual sky that night. The realization settled in Thorne's chest like a cold stone. For the logs to be this perfect, someone had to have bypassed the automated systems and manually overwritten the motor history. They wanted anyone looking back to see a routine night of observation, a scientist quietly studying the 26,000-year cycle of the equinoxes. They wanted the world to believe the telescope was staring into the deep past, watching the slow lean of the planet. But the stars in the images were proof of a different direction. While the record said the telescope was tracking a distant nebula, the actual alignment suggested it had been pointed much lower, toward the dark horizon of the valley below. Someone had used the majesty of the heavens to mask a very earthly transgression. The physics were sound, but the data was a ghost. Thorne leaned back, the blue light of the monitor casting long, distorted shadows against the far wall. The wobble wasn't just in the Earth's axis anymore. The very foundation of the case was beginning to tilt. He thought about the victim, a man who spent his life looking for truth in the most ancient movements of the universe, only to be betrayed by the very numbers he loved. The silence of the observatory felt heavier now, no longer a peaceful sanctuary, but a tomb of curated facts. Every hum of the computer felt like a warning. If the stars could be made to lie, what hope was there for the truth on the ground? Thorne closed his eyes for a moment, letting the image of the skewed star field burn into his retinas. He could feel the vastness of the night pressing against the building, a cold reminder of how small a single life is compared to the celestial cycles. Yet, it was in that tiny, 4,000th of a degree gap that the killer was hiding. A lie written in the language of the cosmos, waiting for someone to notice that the world had shifted just a little too much. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch, reaching toward the glowing screen as the weight of the discovery began to sink in. The door to the observation sublevel did not just close. It sighed with the weight of pressurized air and 30 years of institutional dust. Leo sat there, his fingers tracing the rim of a paper cup that had long since gone cold and soggy. The room was bathed in a singular, sickly yellow light from a flickering fluorescent tube that hummed at a frequency just high enough to prickle the skin. It was a small, cramped space, meant for data entry and late-night coffee, not for unraveling the final, panicked moments of a man who had dedicated his life to the silent movements of the stars. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the faint, metallic tang of the massive telescope machinery that loomed in the dome above us. I watched him for a long moment, noticing the way his narrow shoulders hunched, as if he were trying to pull himself inward, away from the gravity of the questions that were about to fall like lead weights into the quiet of the night. Leo was a junior technician, one of the many invisible hands that kept the giant eye of the observatory turning toward the deep black. He had the look of someone who preferred the cold, predictable company of equations to the messy heat of human interaction. His eyes, rimmed with the deep red fatigue of 3 consecutive sleepless nights, darted toward the corner of the ceiling every few seconds. When he finally began to speak about the night of the incident, his voice was barely a whisper, a dry rasp against the distant, rhythmic thrum of the building's ventilation. He described the way the software had stuttered, a minor deviation in the tracking logs, a mere fraction of a degree that most senior researchers would have dismissed as atmospheric noise or a passing cloud. But Leo had seen it before. He had seen the way the tracking motor hesitated, a mechanical heartbeat skipping in the dark, and he knew it was not the sky playing tricks. To understand the weight of a single degree in this world, one must imagine a line drawn from the very center of the Earth, stretching out across the infinite, lonely black to touch a single, distant point of light. A shift of even 0.001 degrees can mean the difference between observing a dying sun or staring into the empty, meaningless void. Leo explained this with a slow, agonizing precision, his hands finally coming to rest on the table. The friction of his palms against the worn laminate surface made a sound like dry leaves skittering over cold pavement. He told me that the victim, the professor, had been obsessed with the Precession Wobble, the natural, agonizingly slow rotation of the Earth's axis over 26,000 years. But the wobble Leo found that night was unnatural. It was sharp, sudden, and deliberate. It was a testimony written in the cold language of physics, suggesting that someone had physically interfered with the telescope's balance. There is a specific kind of bitterness that grows in the long shadows of great men. Leo's voice grew tighter, more brittle, as he spoke of the professional jealousy that permeated the lab like a slow-acting poison. The professor had been a giant in the field, a man whose name was synonymous with the very stars they charted every night. But beneath that brilliance was a culture of exclusion and intellectual theft that had left the junior staff feeling like ghosts. Leo spoke of the way the senior faculty would walk past him without a word, the way his own discoveries were often absorbed into the professor's published papers without so much as a footnote. He described the cold glares in the break room and the way conversations would abruptly die the moment he entered a room. It was an environment where a minor mistake could end a promising career, and a major discovery was often buried if it did not serve the existing hierarchy. The rain began to fall then, a rhythmic, hypnotic drumming against the corrugated metal roof of the laboratory annex. It was a soothing sound, yet it only seemed to underscore the profound isolation of this mountaintop observatory. Leo leaned in closer, his face partially illuminated by the blue light of a flickering monitor across the room. He confessed, with a tremor in his chin, that he had not reported the wobble immediately. He had been paralyzed by fear. In a world where every second of telescope time is worth thousands of dollars, reporting a mechanical error is a massive risk. If he was wrong, he was incompetent and likely unemployed. If he was right, he was the messenger of catastrophic news. He described how he had watched the professor climb the steep metal ladder to the primary mirror housing that night, his silhouette framed against the cold, unblinking starlight. Leo had stayed at his console, watching the data stream, feeling the vibration of that strange wobble through the very floorboards beneath his feet. He spoke of the sudden, hollow silence that followed. The tracking mechanism had abruptly smoothed out, the wobble vanishing as if it had never existed at all. But the professor had not come back down the ladder. Leo waited for 20 minutes, then 30, then 40, his eyes fixed on the slow rotation of the clock on the wall. The ticking felt heavy, each second a mechanical finality. Eventually, he had walked to the base of the telescope, the cold mountain air biting at the back of his neck. He called out the professor's name, but his voice was swallowed by the vast, echoing space of the dome. He described the smell then, not just the usual scent of ozone and grease, but something sweet and metallic, like copper left out in the pouring rain. He knew, even before he found the body slumped against the gear housing, that the degrees had shifted for the very last time. The testimony of the machine had been a warning he was too terrified to heed. As Leo finished his account, he looked down at his trembling hands once more. The flickering light in the room seemed to pulse in time with his shallow breathing. We sat in that heavy silence for a long time, the only sound the distant, muffled rain and the internal cooling systems of the observatory humming their indifferent song. The professional jealousy he described was not just a motive, it was the very atmosphere of the building. Every technician, every researcher, and every intern was a gear in a machine that had finally ground someone to dust. The precession wobble was not just a technical error in the logs. It was the physical manifestation of a life being violently interrupted in the dark. As I watched the junior technician, I realized that the truth was not just hidden in the stars or the digital data logs. It was living in the hesitant, broken rhythm of his voice, and the guilt he carried in every degree of his silence. The transition from the dim, flickering light of Leo's small room to the clinical, unyielding brightness of the forensic engineering lab felt like a physical weight pressing against the eyes. Here, the air was filtered, stripped of the scent of rain and old wood, replaced by the sterile, sharp tang of isopropyl alcohol and the faint, ozone hum of high-powered microscopes. On the central examination table, the gyroscope unit from the security vault sat cradled in a velvet-lined tray. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, a sphere of polished titanium no larger than a grapefruit, yet within its casing lay the captured soul of the building's stability. For days, the engineers had stared at the digital logs, seeing only a strange, rhythmic fluttering in the data that made no sense. It was a digital ghost, a tremor that appeared and disappeared with the regularity of a heartbeat, always occurring just before the system's most critical failures. Forensic engineers do not move with haste. Theirs is a world of microns and infinite patience. One lead investigator, a man whose hands remained as steady as the machines he studied, began the delicate process of peeling back the outer layers of the sphere. The sound of a jeweler's screwdriver engaging with a microscopic screw is a tiny, crystalline click that echoes in the silence of the room. Each turn was a slow, deliberate revolution, felt more in the fingertips than seen with the eye. As the outer shell was lifted away, the inner gimbal assembly was revealed, a series of nested rings that allowed the central rotor to spin without the interference of the world's gravity. It was a perfect map of balance, or at least, it should have been. Under the harsh, focused beam of a fiber optic light, the metal gleamed with a cold, bluish silver, every surface polished to a mirror finish to eliminate even the faintest hint of friction. It was during the third hour of inspection that the team noticed it. Not a broken part, nor a missing gear, but something far more subtle. On the secondary gimbal ring, hidden behind a pivot point that only saw movement during extreme shifts in the building's tilt, there was a patch of dullness. It was no larger than the head of a pin, a microscopic abrasion that broke the perfect symmetry of the polished titanium. To a casual observer, it would have looked like a manufacturing flaw, a tiny scuff from a wayward tool. But as the magnification was increased, the truth began to sharpen into focus. This was not a random mark. It was a series of precision etches, carved with a laser or a diamond-tipped stylus, designed to create a specific minute amount of drag at one very particular angle. It was the mechanical equivalent of a pebble placed in a masterwork watch, a deliberate imperfection meant to trigger a law of physics that most engineers spend their entire careers trying to avoid. This was the secret of the precession wobble. In the world of high-speed rotation, any force applied to a spinning body does not manifest where it is touched. Instead, due to the strange mathematics of angular momentum, the force is felt 90 degrees later in the direction of the spin. By creating that tiny patch of friction, the saboteur had introduced a phantom torque. As the gyroscope spun at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, that microscopic drag caused the axis to tilt ever so slightly, creating a slow, rhythmic circle in the air. This is precession. It is the same motion a toy top makes as it begins to slow down, a graceful, looping dance of the stem. But in a security sensor, this wobble was catastrophic. It created a predictable, repeating error. A physical oscillation that the system's software was programmed to interpret as background vibration from the nearby subway tunnels or the wind against the glass of the skyscraper. The genius of the plan lay in the timing. The engineers realized that the wobble was not constant. It only reached its peak resonance when the building's internal climate control systems shifted the air pressure at exactly 3 in the morning. For those 12 minutes, the gyroscope would enter a state of perfect, harmonic nutation. During this window, the sensor's data became a closed loop. The software, overwhelmed by the mathematical impossibility of the wobble, would essentially freeze its current state to prevent a system-wide crash. It did not stop working. It simply stopped updating. It created a physical blind spot in the reality of the security logs. For those 12 minutes, a person could walk through the most protected corridors, open the heaviest doors, and move through the infrared beams, and the system would report only the steady, unmoving silence of an empty room. The digital eye was open, but it was staring at a fixed image of the past. The engineers stood back from the table, the weight of their discovery settling over them like a heavy fog. They were looking at a crime committed through the mastery of motion and gravity. The logs showed a perfect night, a night where nothing moved and no one entered, but the microscopic scratch on the gimbal ring told a different story. It was a story of a 12-minute shadow, a pocket of time carved out of the digital record by a simple, physical trick. As the lab's cooling fans hummed in the background, one could not help but feel a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If the very laws of physics could be used to blind the eyes of the law, then what other secrets were spinning in the dark, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see the wobble? The investigation had moved past the realm of digital code and into the cold, hard world of steel and torque. And in that world, even the most perfect machine has a breaking point if you know exactly where to touch it. The heavy steel door of the laboratory clicked into place with a finality that seemed to echo through the long, dimly lit corridor. Leaving the engineering deck felt like stepping out of a tomb and into a different kind of silence. The rhythmic hum of the high-voltage machinery faded, replaced by the low, mournful sigh of the station's ventilation system. As we move away from the crime scene and toward the living quarters, the atmosphere shifts. Each footstep on the perforated metal floor plates creates a sharp, hollow sound, a lonely beat in the quiet of the station. Here, the air is thinner and carries a biting chill. It is as if the very walls are exhaling the frost of the world outside, whispering through the vents in a language of metal and ice. The investigators walk with a heavy, deliberate pace, their shadows stretching long and thin under the flickering overhead lights that pulse with a yellow, sickly rhythm. They are headed toward room 112, the private sanctuary of a man who spent his life calculating the tilt of the world, only to be brought down by the friction within it. Stopping before the door to the victim's quarters, the investigators pause. There is a thin layer of frost clinging to the handle, a crystalline growth that speaks of the absolute cold just inches away behind the exterior insulation. When the door groans open, it reveals a space that is startlingly small, a modular box designed for survival rather than comfort. The smell hits first, a mixture of stale coffee, old paper, and the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. The room is a testament to a mind that never quite rested. Books on celestial mechanics are stacked in precarious towers, and the small bunk is covered in handwritten charts. In the corner, a single desk lamp casts a pool of concentrated light over a surface littered with technical drawings. The investigators move slowly, their gloved hands hovering over the personal effects, hesitant to disturb the quiet arrangement of a life interrupted. It is here, in the intimacy of this frozen cell, that the public identity of the brilliant engineer begins to crumble, revealing the jagged edges of a man who was deeply at odds with those around him. Tucked beneath a stack of orbital telemetry reports, they find a locked metal lockbox. It takes a few minutes of careful prying to release the latch, and when it finally pops open, it reveals a hidden history. Inside are several thick manila folders, their edges yellowed by the harsh light of the station. These are not official records, they are private, secret correspondences. The paper feels heavy and brittle between the fingers. As the investigators spread the pages across the desk, a story of intense personal friction begins to emerge. These are letters exchanged over the course of the last 2 years, mostly with a high-profile patent law firm in the city far to the north. The language is dense with legal jargon, but the underlying tone is one of desperate urgency. The victim had been engaged in a clandestine legal battle, one that he had kept entirely hidden from his colleagues on the engineering team. He was fighting for the rights to a discovery he called the Precession Wobble algorithm, a piece of technology designed to synchronize deep space sensors by accounting for the minute periodic shifts in a planet's rotational axis. The precession wobble, in its scientific sense, is a slow and graceful movement. It is the way a planet's axis traces a circle in the sky over thousands of years, a celestial top spinning in slow motion. But in the context of this room, the word takes on a more sinister meaning. The victim's algorithm was a masterwork, a solution to a problem that had plagued the industry for decades. However, the correspondence reveals that he was not the only one claiming credit. Deep within the folders, there is a draft of a failed collaboration agreement between the victim and the station's lead engineer. It appears they had once tried to work together, but the partnership had dissolved into a bitter feud of accusations and counterclaims. The lead engineer had insisted that the core logic of the algorithm belonged to the station's general research fund, while the victim argued that he had developed the primary equations years before he ever stepped foot on this ice. The letters show a progression of anger, from polite professional disagreement to outright threats of litigation. The victim was planning to file a formal injunction the very week he died, an action that would have effectively ended his partner's career and frozen millions of dollars in potential royalties. As the investigators read on, the air in the small room seems to grow even colder. They find a final, unsent letter written in the victim's own hand, dated just 3 days before the crime. In it, he addresses his former collaborator by name, his handwriting shaky but determined. He writes about the betrayal of trust, about how the shared pursuit of science had been poisoned by greed. He mentions a secret meeting they had in the living quarters, a meeting where the lead engineer supposedly tried to buy his silence with a share of the patent. The victim's refusal was absolute. He wrote, "You cannot correct a wobble in the soul with a technical fix." It is a haunting line, one that suggests the personal friction had reached a boiling point. The investigators look around the cramped room again, seeing it now not as a place of rest, but as a site of intense psychological warfare. The secret correspondence proves that the victim felt hunted, even in his own bed. He had been documenting every interaction, every perceived threat, creating a paper trail that he hoped would protect him. But the paper was too thin to stop what was coming. The discovery of the disputed patent changes the entire shape of the investigation. What began as a tragic accident or a random act of violence now looks like a calculated removal of a legal obstacle. The precession wobble was not just a scientific phenomenon, it was the motive. The investigators carefully pack the letters into evidence bags, the plastic crinkling in the silence. They take one last look at the victim's desk, the half-empty cup of coffee, the scattered notes, the single lamp still burning. Outside, the wind howls against the hull of the station, a reminder of the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounds them. The engineers in the other rooms are sleeping, or perhaps they are lying awake, listening to the same whispers in the cold air that the victim once heard. The friction that destroyed this partnership was as inevitable as the laws of physics, a slow-building pressure that finally snapped in the dark. As the investigators close the door to room 112, they carry with them the weight of a secret that the ice could not keep. The case is no longer about the stars. It is about the cold, hard reality of what men will do when their legacy is at stake. The server room of the observatory felt like a different world entirely, a subterranean vault where the temperature was kept at a constant, biting chill. It was a place of humming silence, where the only sound was the collective whir of 1,000 cooling fans, a white noise that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of one's bones. Detective Miller stood before the monolithic towers of the mainframe, their black obsidian surfaces reflecting the dim blue glow of status lights that blinked with the rhythmic pulse of a digital heart. Every few seconds, a series of amber flickers would race across the panels, signaling a burst of data being processed from the distant, cold reaches of the cosmos. To the detective, the air here tasted like ozone and filtered dust, a sterile environment designed to protect the fragile silicon brains that translated the secrets of the stars into lines of cold, hard logic. The sheer scale of the information stored here was overwhelming. It was a library of the infinite, containing records of celestial movements that spanned millions of years. He pulled out a heavy metal chair, the legs scraping softly against the raised floor tiles, a sound that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the omnipresent hum. As he sat at the primary console, the screen came to life, bathing his tired face in a pale, flickering light. His fingers, stiff from the cold, hovered over the keyboard for a moment of quiet hesitation. This was the digital footprint he had been searching for, the invisible trail left behind by a phantom that moved through wires rather than woods. He began the process of peeling back the layers of security, entering passwords that felt like incantations to open the gates of this silent kingdom. The interface was a relic of complex engineering, designed for astronomers and physicists, not for those hunting a killer, yet the language of the machine was universal in its honesty. It did not lie. It only remembered what had been asked of it, recording every touch and every command with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying. The investigation into the precession wobble had led him here, to the exact microsecond when the massive telescope had shuddered in its tracks. He began to pull the logs from that specific night, the 19th of October. On the screen, thousands of lines of code began to scroll by, a cascade of green text that represented the lifeblood of the observatory. He was looking for a ghost in the machine, a discrepancy that shouldn't exist. He moved slowly, his eyes tracking the timestamps that were written out in agonizing detail. 02:45:12 seconds. Then, at 02:45:13 seconds, the anomaly appeared. It was a subtle shift, a sudden spike in the processor load that had no corresponding command from the authorized terminals. It was as if a second hand had reached out from the shadows and grasped the controls, a silent intervention that redirected the entire system's focus for a fraction of a heartbeat. As Miller dug deeper, the sophistication of the intrusion became chillingly clear. This wasn't a crude brute force attack from the outside world. There were no traces of a remote connection, no pings from distant servers in foreign lands. Instead, the entry point was identified as a local node, a terminal located within the very walls of this facility. The digital footprint was remarkably clean, suggesting a level of expertise that bordered on the professional. The hacker had utilized a series of internal bypasses that were only known to a handful of senior staff members, gliding through the firewalls as if they were nothing more than silk curtains. He watched as the screen displayed the origin point of the command, Terminal 7, the basement laboratory. The realization hit him with the weight of a physical blow. The call was coming from inside the house, or in this case, the very foundation of the mountain they stood upon. The timing was too perfect to be anything other than a calculated act of sabotage. At the exact moment the telescope's sensors recorded the gravitational anomaly, that strange, impossible wobble in the precession data, the internal hack had been executed. It had effectively blinded the system, wiping the raw telemetry data before it could be backed up to the off-site servers. Miller leaned back, his eyes fixed on the glowing terminal. He imagined the perpetrator sitting in the dark, their face illuminated by the same cold light he was currently seeing, their fingers dancing over the keys as they dismantled the work of a lifetime. The sophistication of the code used to hide the tracks was breathtaking. It was a self-deleting script that had scrubbed 99% of its own history, leaving only this tiny, microscopic shadow of a footprint behind for him to find. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a violation of the sanctuary of science. He spent the next hour tracing the ghost's path back through the subdirectories, finding small breadcrumbs of intent. The intruder hadn't just deleted data, they had altered the calibration constants for the telescope's steering motors. By changing a single digit in the mathematical model of the Earth's axis, they had forced the massive instrument to lurch against its own weight, creating the physical vibration that everyone had assumed was an earthquake or a mechanical failure. It was a digital murder of a scientific truth. Miller felt a cold sweat break out despite the freezing room. The person who did this knew the observatory better than they knew themselves. They knew where the blind spots were, both in the security cameras and in the software architecture. As he closed the final file, the hum of the servers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the machines themselves were trying to tell him the name of the shadow who had walked among them. The observatory at 3 in the morning is a cathedral of synthetic silence. It is a place where the air is filtered, dried, and chilled to protect the delicate mirrors that peer into the infinite. Elias sat in the glowing hum of the monitoring station, his eyes heavy, but his mind sharp. The digital breadcrumbs from the previous hour had led him to a wall of logs, a fortress of data that refused to yield. He could still feel the phantom weight of those deleted files, the traces of intent left by an intruder who moved through the servers like a shadow through a forest. Outside, the mountain wind pressed against the heavy steel of the dome, a low, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the building. It was here, in the quiet overlap of the mechanical and the celestial, that the first true crack in the story began to show itself, a tiny wobble in an otherwise perfect rotation. Dr. Eris Thorne had been very specific during his initial questioning. He was a man of precision, a man who measured his life in arcseconds and light years. He claimed that during the critical window of the blackout, he had never left the server room. He spoke of the task with a weary kind of patience, explaining how the cooling unit in Rack 4 had been struggling under the summer load. He told the investigators that he spent those 45 minutes seated on a small plastic crate, his back against the vibrating metal, watching the blue light of the status indicators. He described the smell of ozone and the way the forced air made the hair on his arms stand up. It was a grounded alibi, a humble one. It placed him in a room filled with witnesses of a different sort. Thousands of processors hummed as his only company, their blinking lights a mechanical testimony to his presence. But the observatory is more than just a place for looking up. It is a place that is constantly looking at itself. To maintain the thermal equilibrium necessary for deep space imaging, the facility is equipped with a network of high-sensitivity infrared sensors. These are not standard security cameras. They do not see faces or colors. Instead, they see the ghost light of heat. They see the lingering warmth on a chair where a body once sat, or the faint bloom of energy trailing behind a person walking through a cold corridor. Elias began to pull the thermal archives from the night in question. On his screen, the floor plan of the research wing appeared in shades of deep indigo and violet. The server room was a bright, static square of orange, a heart of heat pumping data through the veins of the building. At first glance, everything seemed to support Thorne's narrative. The heat signature of the servers was so immense that it masked everything within the four walls of that room. Then, Elias adjusted the contrast, narrowing the thermal window to focus specifically on the range of human body temperature. He watched the clock at the bottom of the screen. At exactly 12 minutes past midnight, a sliver of warmth began to detach itself from the central glow of the server racks. It was subtle, like a drop of ink in water. It was a human-shaped bloom of amber, soft-edged and rhythmic. According to Dr. Thorne, he should have remained a stationary part of that orange square for another half hour. But the logs told a different story. The heat signature did not stay on the plastic crate. It moved toward the heavy, lead-lined door of the server room. Elias watched, his breath hitching, as the amber shape paused for 3 seconds at the threshold, perhaps checking the hallway, perhaps hesitating, before it stepped out into the dark violet of the main corridor. The movement was deliberate. It was not the hurried pace of someone responding to an emergency, nor the aimless wandering of a man taking a break. It was a steady, calculated stride. The signature moved north, away from the offices, away from the break room, and toward the spiral staircase that led to the primary telescope dome. Each footstep left a tiny, fading petal of warmth on the cold concrete floor, a trail of evidence that would have been invisible 5 minutes later, but remained etched in the digital memory of the infrared sensors. The heat signature reached the base of the stairs and began to climb. Elias followed the camera feeds, switching from the hallway to the stairwell. The shape was climbing higher now, ascending into the belly of the great eye, the very place Thorne swore he had not visited until the following morning. The drift in the narrative was no longer a suspicion. It was a visible, glowing reality. In astronomy, there is a concept known as precession. It is the slow, circular wobble of the Earth's axis, a movement so gradual that it takes 26,000 years to complete a single cycle. It means that the North Star we see today is not the North Star of the ancient past, and it will not be the North Star of the future. The orientation of the entire world shifts, degree by agonizing degree, until the map of the heavens no longer matches the reality of the sky. As Elias watched the amber ghost of Dr. Thorne reach the observation deck, he realized he was witnessing a precession of a different kind. The axis of the investigation had shifted. The steady point of truth that Thorne had provided was wobbling, tilting away from the light. The man of precision had forgotten that even in the darkest, coldest corners of the mountain, we always leave a part of our warmth behind, a glowing signature of where we have been and what we have done. The air inside the observation deck had grown thin and brittle, smelling faintly of ozone and the heavy, metallic scent of ancient lubricants. Outside, the mountain wind pressed against the silver skin of the dome, a low, rhythmic thrum that felt more like a heartbeat than a sound. For 3 nights, the investigation had stalled, caught in the vacuum of missing data and the peculiar silence of the primary security systems. The high-definition arrays, designed to capture the birth of distant nebulas, had been pointed toward the void, their digital eyes blinded by the very darkness they were meant to penetrate. We sat in the glowing amber light of the control room, the steady pulse of a single server fan the only companion to our exhaustion. It was then that a junior technician, fingers trembling slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep, remembered the secondary weather camera. It was a modest piece of hardware, a ruggedized lens encased in a soot-stained housing, bolted to the exterior catwalk to monitor cloud cover and local humidity. It was never intended to witness a crime. It was merely a silent observer of the atmosphere, a humble tool meant to tell the astronomers when the rain might come or when the fog would settle into the valley like a thick, gray blanket. The weather camera operated on a separate, older circuit, one that had been overlooked by whoever had meticulously scrubbed the main servers. To access its archives, we had to bypass the sleek glass interfaces and move into the back maintenance crawl space, where the air was thick with the smell of warm dust and copper wiring. The drive itself was a heavy, spinning disk, an antique in a world of flash memory. As it whirred to life, the sound was like a long, slow sigh. We watched the monitor, a small, flicking screen that displayed the world in shades of charcoal and silver. The footage was grainy, the frame rate dragging at only 4 frames per second, making every movement look like a series of still ghosts. At first, there was nothing but the slow, majestic sweep of the Milky Way overhead. The camera was wide-angled, capturing the massive curve of the dome as it rotated on its tracks. We watched the clock at the bottom of the screen, the white numbers crawling toward 2:45 in the morning. The stars moved in their ancient, processional dance, shifting ever so slightly as the Earth performed its slow, invisible wobble through the cosmos. As the dome began its programmed rotation to follow a star cluster in the western quadrant, something peculiar happened on the glass surface of the weather camera's housing. Because of the extreme cold outside, a thin, crystalline layer of frost had begun to lace the edges of the lens, creating a natural frame of jagged ice. The light from the interior of the observatory, usually kept to a dull, red glow to protect the sensitive instruments, suddenly flared. It wasn't a direct light, but a spill. Someone had opened the inner airlock door, a heavy slab of reinforced steel that should have been sealed until dawn. The weather camera was positioned at a specific, obtuse angle. As the massive aperture of the main telescope dome slid open, the polished glass of the dome's interior became, for a fleeting moment, a mirror. It was a trick of optics, a rare alignment of the curved surface and the low-light sensors. In that reflection, hidden within the distorted curve of the glass, we saw a shape. It was not a star, nor a smudge of frost. It was a silhouette, draped in a heavy, dark coat that absorbed the faint red light, making the figure look like a hole cut out of reality. We leaned in, our breaths hitching as we studied the distorted image. The figure was standing by the primary cooling vent, their posture rigid and intentional. Because of the dome's curvature, the reflection was stretched, pulled thin like a shadow cast at sunset. We could see the gloved hand reaching out, a pale, almost luminous movement against the dark machinery. The hand moved with a chilling precision, navigating the complex array of valves and sensors as if it had memorized them in the dark. This was not a random intruder. This was someone who understood the anatomy of the observatory, someone who knew that the Earth's precession would require the dome to be at this exact degree of rotation at this exact hour. The shadow on the lens was a ghost of a person, a whisper of evidence caught in a backup camera that should have been turned off months ago. We watched as the figure paused, looking up toward the primary lens of the telescope. For 1 second, the red light hit the person's face. It wasn't enough to see features, but it was enough to see the glint of a watch on their wrist, a small, circular reflection that pulsed like a dying star. The movement of the watch was steady, the second hand sweeping in a silent circle that seemed to mock the vast, slow time of the stars above. As the technician paused the frame, the image shivered, the pixels struggling to hold the shape of the intruder. We spent the next 4 hours enhancing the grain, trying to pull meaning from the noise. Every time we zoomed in, the shadow seemed to retreat, dissolving into a chaotic static of grays and blacks. Yet the presence was undeniable. The shadow on the lens proved that the failure of the cooling system wasn't a mechanical glitch caused by the shifting weight of the Earth's axis. It was an act of deliberate, quiet sabotage. Someone had used the slow, predictable wobble of our planet to hide their movements, knowing that at 2:47, the main security cameras would be pointed directly into the glare of the rising moon, leaving the cooling vents in total darkness. They hadn't counted on the weather camera, a small, forgotten eye tucked away on the frozen catwalk. They hadn't counted on the way a single drop of condensation on the glass could turn a window into a mirror, capturing a secret that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. The discovery changed the temperature of the room. It was no longer a technical puzzle to be solved by engineers. It was a crime scene, a place where the laws of physics had been weaponized. We sat in silence for a long time, watching that single, frozen frame. The intruder's silhouette was bowed, almost as if they were in prayer before the massive machine they were about to break. There is something deeply unsettling about seeing a reflection of a person where no person should be, a phantom caught in the silvering of a lens. It reminded me of the way ancient mariners felt about the precession of the equinoxes, a slow, terrifying shift of the heavens that suggested the world was not as stable as it seemed. Here, in the heart of the mountain, the stability of the institution was crumbling. The shadow on the lens was a signature, a dark ink blot on the clean history of the observatory. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a cold, blue light across the peaks, we knew that the hunt had finally begun. The wobble of the Earth would continue for another 25,000 years, but for the person in the dark coat, time was finally running out. The air inside the decommissioned satellite hangar felt like a heavy, frozen weight. It was nearly midnight, and the only sound was the low, rhythmic thrum of the cooling fans that kept the sensitive electronics from overheating. Detective Miller adjusted the collar of his wool coat, his breath forming small, fleeting clouds of mist that vanished into the darkness of the high ceilings. Beside him, the massive tracking assembly, a sprawling skeleton of steel and carbon fiber, loomed like a dormant beast. It was here, amidst the silent gears and precision sensors, that the truth was hidden. For weeks, the data had suggested a simple technical failure, a momentary lapse in the machine's focus. But tonight, they were looking for a ghost. The concrete floor was cold enough to seep through their boots, reminding them that the world was indifferent to human violence. Dr. Elias Thorne walked into the pool of amber light, his footsteps light and precise. He was a man who lived in the world of subatomic shifts and planetary rotations, someone who saw the universe as a series of equations waiting to be balanced. In his hands, he carried a small, heavy brass gyroscope, its surface polished to a mirror finish. He did not look at the detectives immediately. Instead, he gazed up at the tracking arm, his eyes tracing the path it would have taken on that fateful night. He spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, yet it carried across the hangar with a clarity that demanded attention. He explained that everything in motion wants to stay in motion, but when a force is applied at a right angle, something strange happens. The concept of the precession wobble is something most people only experience as a child, watching a spinning top begin to circle as it loses its momentum. But in the world of high-precision automated tracking, a wobble is a catastrophe. Thorne explained that the system was designed to self-correct for natural vibrations. The wind hitting the exterior of the building, the distant rumble of a freight train, or the rotation of the Earth itself. However, if a human hand were to apply a specific, rhythmic pressure to the housing of the gyroscope at just the right frequency, the system would enter a state of forced precession. To the software, it would look like a minor harmonic resonance, a common glitch that it was programmed to ignore. To the person standing in the room, however, it was a shield to hide a struggle. The detectives moved into position under the great steel arm. Detective Vance played the role of the intruder, his movements calculated and slow. Detective Sarah Chen stood where the victim, an engineer named Marcus, had been standing just 4 weeks ago. The silence in the hangar grew thick, heavy with the weight of what they were about to recreate. Thorne signaled to the technicians in the glass-walled control room. A low hum filled the air as the tracking system began its automated sweep, its lens glowing with a faint, blue light as it searched for the calibration points on the far wall. The machine moved with a grace that was almost unsettling, a masterpiece of engineering that never blinked. But they were about to prove that even a perfect eye can be blinded. "Begin," Thorne said softly. Vance lunged forward, not with the speed of a cinematic fight, but with the clumsy, desperate weight of a real struggle. As he collided with Sarah, his shoulder struck the main support pillar of the tracking assembly. At the same moment, he reached out and gripped the rotating housing, his fingers digging into the cold metal. He did not just hold it. He pushed against the rotation, a deliberate, pulsing pressure that mirrored the frequency Thorne had calculated from the corrupted data logs. The heavy arm groaned, a sound like a distant whale call echoing through the hangar. Under their feet, the concrete seemed to vibrate. The two detectives grappled, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the floor, while the machine above them began to shiver. It was a physical induction of a theoretical principle, a marriage of physics and murder. In the control room, the monitors showed a jagged, rhythmic line of red data. The shiver appeared exactly as it had in the original logs from the night of the crime. To the automated safety protocols, the system was simply experiencing a Type 4 harmonic interference. It had continued its sweep, blithely unaware that beneath its sensors, a man was being strangled to death. The realization settled over the room like a layer of fine dust. The killer was someone who understood the heartbeat of the machine. They had turned a masterpiece of engineering into an accomplice. As the detectives stepped away from each other, breathless and cold, the tracking arm finally stilled. The reenactment was over. The theory was now a fact. The darkness of the hangar felt deeper, knowing technology had been defeated by a simple, manual wobble. The air in the high-altitude observatory had a peculiar, metallic quality, a mixture of ozone from the massive cooling units and old dust trapped behind the server racks. It was a cold place, even with the heaters humming at their maximum capacity. For the heat was the enemy of the glass, the enemy of the crystalline clarity they required to peer into the deep reaches of the void. Julian Vane sat in his chair, his silhouette sharp against the rhythmic glow of the flickering monitors. He didn't move as I entered, but the tension in his shoulders was visible, a rigidity that mirrored the cold steel of the telescope mount above us. Outside, the wind screamed across the peak, a lonely, high-pitched whistle that seemed to underscore the isolation of this moment. Here, under the watchful eyes of the stars, there was nowhere left for him to hide. I walked slowly toward the primary console, my footsteps sounding muffled on the thick, anti-static matting. The screen before us was dominated by that single, jagged line of red data, the shiver. It was a rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat, that appeared exactly as it had in the original logs. In the records he had used to construct his alibi for the night the research was stolen, Julian had presented a sequence of coordinates that were perfect. They were beautiful in their precision, documenting the window where he claimed to be tracking a distant quasar. He said his eyes were locked to the lens and his hands were steady on the manual override. But that very beauty was his undoing. I reached out and tapped the glass, the surface vibrating under my finger as I asked him to look at the ghost in the machine. Julian finally spoke, his voice thin and brittle, like old parchment being torn by a careless hand. He repeated his story, the long, solitary hours spent in the dark, the absolute dedication to a discovery that he believed would change the way we understood the birth of galaxies. He spoke of the exhaustion, the way the light from the quasar felt like a needle of ice in his eye. If he was here, recording those exact coordinates, he couldn't have been in the lower labs, destroying the life's work of a colleague who had finally surpassed him. He thought he had accounted for everything, including the atmospheric refraction and the slight delay of the signal. He was a master of the heavens, after all. He knew the sky better than he knew the faces of his own children, and he believed the stars would protect his lie. But the stars are indifferent to the ambitions of men, and they obey laws that do not yield to convenience. I began to speak then, my voice low and steady, explaining the concept of the precession wobble. I talked about how the Earth is not a perfect sphere, how it is slightly flattened at the poles, and how the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun causes our planet to wobble like a slow-spinning top. It is a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete, a movement of the entire axis of our world. But within that grand movement, there is a smaller, more frantic shudder, the nutation, a cycle of 18.6 years that causes the celestial pole to wander in a tiny, elliptical path. It is a minute change, a fraction of a degree, but in the world of high-precision astronomy, it is everything. I watched his hands. They were resting on the edge of the desk, and now, for the first time, his fingers began to tremble. He had faked his logs using a standard celestial map, a digital projection that assumed a fixed point of reference. He had forgotten that on that specific night, the nutation of the Earth's axis had reached its peak, creating a 3-arcsecond discrepancy. If he had truly been looking through the telescope, his coordinates would have shown that tiny, rhythmic shiver, the very red line that was now pulsing on the screen. By providing coordinates that were too perfect, he had proven that he was nowhere near the lens. He had been working from a desk, calculating what he thought the stars would look like, failing to account for the living, breathing wobble of the planet beneath his feet. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on us both. The mathematical impossibility of his presence was a verdict from which there was no appeal. Finally, Julian slumped, the air leaving his lungs in a long, shaky sigh. He admitted it then, the theft and the motive. He had discovered that the research he stole was the very thing he had been seeking for decades. It was a career-ending revelation to realize that a younger mind had solved the equation he had failed to master. He couldn't let it stand. He had to erase it, to take it as his own. But the shadows had already arrived, written in red on a glowing screen, dictated by the very celestial bodies he had spent his life worshipping. The truth was as immutable as the stars themselves. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. The gavel falls with a dry, hollow sound that echoes against the polished marble and the heavy oak paneling of the courtroom. It is a sound of finality, a sharp punctuation mark at the end of a very long and exhausting sentence. After months of testimony, of technical jargon and astronomical charts pinned to corkboards like captured ghosts, the silence that follows is almost physical in its weight. In that quiet, you can hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the back wall, a steady and indifferent reminder that while human drama unfolds in these sterile rooms, time itself remains unbothered. The jurors file out, their faces etched with the weariness of those who have had to stare into the abyss of another person's soul. They carry with them the burden of a decision that bridges the gap between the infinite, cold reaches of the cosmos and the narrow, dark corners of the human heart. The long night, which began with a missing light in the mountain observatory and ended here in the heat of a summer afternoon, has finally reached its dawn. The evidence had been as complex as the stars themselves. We spent weeks listening to experts explain the intricacies of the precession wobble, that slow, graceful shift of the Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one full circle. It was the victim's life's work, a study of how even the most stable bodies in the universe are subject to a subtle, inevitable drift. The prosecution argued that this discovery, this tiny correction in the known movement of our planet, was worth more than a life to someone blinded by professional jealousy. They showed us the digital logs, the way the data had been manipulated in the dark hours of the morning, and the specific way the telescope had been tilted to hide a crime under the cover of a routine calibration. It was a case built on the most minute of details, where a fraction of a degree in a star's position became the smoking gun in a murder trial. The defense tried to paint it as an accident, a tragic malfunction in the high-altitude air, but the numbers did not lie. Mathematics, like the stars, is a silent witness that never forgets. There is a profound sadness in the intersection of high science and low human impulse. We like to think that those who study the heavens are somehow elevated above the pettiness of earthly greed, but this case proved otherwise. The defendant sat in the dock, a person who spent their nights peering through millions of miles of vacuum to find beauty, yet who could not see the value of the human life standing right next to them. The motive was as old as time, a bitter resentment that had fermented in the isolation of the high peaks. As the verdict was read, there was no outcry, only a heavy sigh that seemed to travel through the gallery like a slow-moving wave. The truth was out, stripped of its academic prestige and laid bare in the harsh light of the law. The brilliance of the discovery remained, but the hands that had reached for it were now bound by the consequences of their actions. It is a reminder that the same tilt that causes the seasons to change can also cause a life to veer tragically off course. Now the focus shifts back to the mountain, far away from the crowded hallways of the courthouse. The observatory stands in its silent vigil, a silver dome reflecting the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The air up there is thin and crisp, smelling of pine needles and cold stone. The telescope, once a silent witness to a terrible act, has been cleaned and recalibrated. Its great lens points upward once more, searching for the truth among the constellations. There is a peace that returns to a place once the secrets have been told. The heavy equipment hums with a low, soothing vibration, a mechanical purr that speaks of continuity and the pursuit of knowledge. The researchers who remain speak in hushed tones, not out of fear anymore, but out of a renewed respect for the work. They understand now that the stars they watch are indifferent to our sorrows, yet they provide the only map we have through the darkness. The shadows that once clung to the corners of the laboratory have dissipated. replaced by the steady, blinking lights of the servers and the quiet breathing of the night shift. The victim's name is now etched in the annals of science, forever linked to the wobble they spent their final days measuring. It is a legacy of light, a small piece of the universal puzzle solved at a staggering cost. As we look back on this journey, we see that justice is often like the stars we study. It may seem distant, and the light may take a long time to reach us, but it is always there, burning steadily in the void. We have followed the trail from the frozen mountain passes to the heat of the courtroom, and finally, back to the stillness of the heavens. The human heart is a complex engine, prone to its own wobbles and shifts, but in the end, we find our way back to the center. The story of the Precession Wobble is finally complete, a narrative arc that has spanned years and miles, concluding with a sense of somber resolution. The earth continues its slow, tilting dance, and we continue our journey along with it, moving forward into a night that is finally clear of its ghosts. Take a moment to feel the world turning beneath you. It is a slow, steady motion, a constant in an ever-changing universe. The weight of the investigation has been lifted, and the questions that kept us awake have been answered. There is nothing left to solve, no more clues to uncover, and no more theories to weigh. The mountain is quiet. The stars are bright. The long night has truly ended, leaving behind only the peaceful rhythm of the cosmos. Let the tension leave your shoulders and the thoughts of the trial drift away like smoke in the wind. You have walked through the shadows and emerged into the light of the truth. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.